Hi, all. I hope you're doing well and staying safe. Today, I want to talk a bit about the history of the concept of race, and I want to talk about some of the kind of pre theoretic notions that are built into it. Note some of the ways in which those pre theoretic notions or presuppositions vary quite substantially across both geography in different parts of the world today. Race is conceived of in slightly different ways. And also, over time, there's been a great deal of variation and a great deal of controversy over how exactly the notion of race should be conceived, how many categories of race there are, etc. So we'll talk about some of the historic developments concerning the notion of race as a kind of like scientific concept that can organize human beings into different categories, what the purported status of that is, the underlying kind of theoretical commitments that become more apparent over time as these discussions between various theorists about race try to provide a comprehensive theory and one that has relevantly clear empirical commitments that can be shown to be true. We find that there's actually a great deal of challenge associated with this, and we'll see an argument to the effect that there is no such thing as race when that's construed as a sort of biological category. And we'll look at theories of race then that, in virtue of that, attempt to provide some way of understanding, in quite general terms, what sort of a thing race is and whether there are any. So, the notion of race is quite deeply interwoven into a lot of facets of everyday life. It has an incredible shaping effect on the course of human history. People understand themselves partially in virtue of these notions quite often. And there's quite often seemingly a sort of a scientific authority to the notion of race, as though it's something that is a genuine part of the world and that it is somehow sort of natural. So we're going to look at and interrogate some of these ideas, and some kind of useful organizing questions for this is, well, what kind of a thing is a race? One might say that this person is black or white or Asian or some other category. And, well, what exactly does it mean to sort of person into a category like that? What are the contours of these categories? What is the sort of realness of this category? Is there some principled way in which the category is organized, or is it fundamentally kind of arbitrary? How does it differ from other sorts of categories that carve up populations of people, like that of ethnicity? Say that somebody is Asian American or that they're German. This, as a kind of ethnicity, refers to the sort of cultural background within which they grow up. A lot of their kind of cultural identity is bound up in this. Nationality, this is something that could change over time. One could become a citizen of another nation, and so this is not bound in the same way that seemingly categories like race or species are. Ethnicity also seems to be somewhat more firm than nationality in this respect. It seems to be something that could more plausibly be taken to be something like a natural category, whereas nationality is obviously a kind of social category. The notion of species And we'll see during part of the sort of historical development of the concept of race, there's an attempt to tie the notion of race to that of species and to say race is something like a subspecies class. There's the important question of how we should sort of understand the relation between race and racism, which concept is actually prior, whether races are these categories that pre-exist, and then racism is types of discriminatory behavior that are animated by those as a sort of focal point, or racism whether racism is prior and there are self-regarding sort of attitudes and behaviors, and those then get manifest in ways that otherize and allege the inferiority of others, and that race then is a sort of consequence of this practice. And there's the question, well, is this category actually picking out something real in the world? One of the ways in which we can kind of tease this idea out is thinking about other scientific concepts. Race, we'll see, emerges as a concept that aspires to a kind of scientific nature, meaning it intends to carve nature at its joints. Or is it a concept like witchcraft, which has a kind of explanatory power, but which fails to accurately really capture the mechanics of the world, or fails to provide us with any sort of theorem which could be derivable from the laws of nature and particular states of the world? So if we begin to look at what we might describe as sort of pre-theoretical inherited notions of race, there's the idea that racial differences are manifest in some physically observable manner in terms of things like skin color or facial features or hair texture. And the idea that, well, you can, by looking at a person, identify which race they are a member of. It is something purportedly kind of natural, and it's a heritable trait. So you can determine a person's membership in a racial category on the basis of the racial categories that their parents occupy, that there's some way in which this is tied to geographic facts. So perhaps there are racial categories that are tied to each of the major continents. Say somebody who is Asian is such because ultimately their ancestors are from Asia, or someone who is Black has ancestors who are from Africa, someone who is white has ancestors from Europe. It'll turn out that if we look at a kind of elongated history of human evolution, then this is going to become tenuous when we recognize that all human beings have a common point of origin, although we'll see this is also a point of contention amongst some race theorists following its early advent. There's the idea that different races have different physical or mental capabilities. It's worth noting that this assumption is quite obviously self-racist, and this is quite deeply bound up in the history and development of this concept of race. We'll see that the concept of race is itself developed in large part during European colonial and imperial projects, and it provides a kind of post hoc justification for their treatment. That there's also the assumption that there are associated with different races different sets of cultural and attitudinal kind of factors and behaviors, and this is bound up with the sort of like stereotyping that is associated with race. There's also, and we'll see that this is a more sort of idiosyncratic feature of the way in which races are conceived of within the US and kind of broadly dominant culture in North America. The idea that races are more or less pure, and this is particularly bound in the US to the history of slavery and this sort of obsession with what they term miscegenation, and that gets codified in the one drop rule, that if a person has one ancestor who is black, then they count as black in the US. This is called hypodescent, or the sort of theoretical notion associated with this idea of the manner of classification is called hypodescent. And the idea is that the race of a child can be determined by the social standing of their parents, and if those categories can be sort of conceived of hierarchically, as they often do, because these categories get used to kind of recreate racist hierarchies. So in the US, people can often have like one black parent and one white parent, and they will be classified as black. And to some extent, this seems kind of arbitrary. It doesn't seem like there's anything sort of like identifiable at the sort of biological level that could sort of justify or necessitate this allocation of people into categories. And if we look around the world, then we'll see that this isn't sort of ubiquitous, or it's not universally assumed to be the way in which racial categories relate to one another. So there's the sort of contrasting function of what's called hyperdescent, in which the race of a child is determined by the social standing of its parents and is assigned to the highest social standing of those parents. So this doesn't inherently mean that this will produce a less racist set of practices. This kind of sort of system of sorting is present in parts of South America. It's also present in Australia in the treatment of Aborigines people. And during and throughout the 20th century, leading up until the 1970s, the children of Aborigines people would be the children who had, like, say, one Aborigines parent and a parent who was of British ancestry. They would be taken away from their Aborigines parent, and they would be punished if they spoke their mother tongue. And so this constitutes a kind of like cultural destruction, a sort of genocide, in that this practice is aimed at the destruction of like a way of life and of an identity for a set of people. So there's quite a bit of seeming arbitrariness in exactly the way in which the categories operate in terms of the means by which classifications relate to one another. And so what will be true of the sort of pre-theoretic notions of race that are active in, say, the US will be different than the kind of pre-theoretic notions that are active in, say, parts of Europe, and those will be different from the sort of pre-theoretic notions in parts of Asia. For instance, in Europe, while the sort of pre-theoretic notion of race in the US would say, well, all Europeans are white, there's to some extent still, and definitely in the past, attempt to subdivide Europeans into different racial categories. So Southern Europeans are often the target of the kind of racist like thinking and prejudicial practices that get associated with this codification. If we go back, say, to the time of the ancient Greeks and look at the ways in which people sorted or were sorted into different categories and the ways in which people thought about their social relations to one another, then it's worth noting that there's nothing quite like the notion of race that now animates so much of our thought and talk concerning the appearances of people and these various sort of presuppositions that are tied to that. This isn't to say that there weren't prejudicial practices or ways of classifying people. There were, but they didn't have the sort of classification schema whereby they said, this is a sort of natural fact about a person in virtue of which they can be usefully classified into some category. The ancient Greeks used the notion of phyle, which maps roughly onto the idea of tribe or clan. This is tied to a kind of notion of geographic origin, but it's mostly a kind of social and political category. And so it's less sort of like firm or solid than the notion of race purports to be. In Aristotle, there's talk about a sort of distinction between Greeks and barbarians or foreigners, and the sort of diminutive thinking about the converse category here seems to carry much of the sort of like diminutive thinking of like various racists. We don't see any sort of category that begins to attempt to classify people in terms of something purportedly natural that then has all these determining influences on various sort of physiological, but also like cultural and attitudinal characteristics purportedly, until around the time of the early 900s in the Iberian Peninsula. This becomes also later the sort of birthplace of the notion of race. There's a French anthropologist, we'll see, who develops the first classification in the 1600s. Part of what I want to kind of emphasize here is that I think there's a common sort of misconception that, well, the notion of race must have existed as long as human beings have. And if we take a kind of a distanced look here, then on our contemporary best sort of evolutionary biological account, Homo sapiens have been alive for, or have existed for around 250 to 300,000 years. They've had linguistic capacities for about 80,000. And we see that through much of that, there isn't anything really remotely resembling the notion of race that we have today. So it's a relatively recent development. And we begin to see this sort of proto-concept of race, something that is purportedly biological, which can sort people into different groups, and has this consequent sort of social and political import, as it begins in the Iberian Peninsula as a response to a generation of varying sort of like political and religious subcultures. The Iberian Peninsula is under the dominion of Isabel and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarchs, and the Iberian Peninsula becomes home to a large number of not only Catholics, but also Muslims. There's the Moorish invasion in the late 800s, and there's also a large population of Jewish people. And this is seen to some extent as a threat by Isabel and Ferdinand, and it's under their rule that the Inquisition begins inquiring into the lineages of people to determine whether they were devoted followers prior to the 900s or whether they might perhaps be converts of convenience who have professed this faith because they would rather not be tortured. And so there's here the idea that there's something sort of substantive in the person that warrants greater or lesser degree of respect or dignity, it seems. The idea that those who were able to prove their lineage, who had held this like belief for so long, they were somehow more genuine than people whose ancestors had not. And so there's this sort of proto-concept that develops over a period of several hundred years, and we begin to see the first real kind of explicit articulation of a concept of race as a kind of concept that could distinguish different peoples on the basis of these sort of phenotypic characteristics, things purportedly like skin color and like the sort of like statistical variation of like one's face, perhaps, other sorts of characteristics like these. We'll see that all of those sort of characteristics end up being quite difficult to hold sort of across various cases. And we'll see that if we really begin interrogating the ways in which these categories are applied, there is a whole lot of arbitrariness about the various sort of ways in which we should understand the necessary and sufficient conditions associated with those concepts. So to give you some kind of historical context, this is around the time of Descartes. It will be a bit after he's passed. And so the sort of significance of that is this is as there's this sort of rebirth of this idea that human beings are rational creatures and that they are sort of uniquely capable of self-governance, and that in virtue of that, they are reasonably afforded autonomy and self-determination. And this is at the same time that various European powers have begun colonizing both parts of Africa and the Americas. And there's a great deal of cognitive dissonance between this practice and the sort of prior philosophical belief that human beings are all capable of reason, are all capable of self-governance, and yet there's the institution, or there's the instituting of people into conditions of slavery, of depriving them of any sort of self-determination, of failing to recognize their humanity. And we see the sort of emergence of race as a kind of way of smoothing over that tension. It says, well, there's not actually a sort of outright contradiction here. It's that there's these different racial categories and different races have different capabilities. And so in virtue of that, some are more capable of self-governance than others. So fairly apparent from this synopsis version that the sort of theoretical introduction of the notion of race plays a very kind of pernicious social effect. And we'll see that that perniciousness is kind of reproduced through its various iterations. The kind of historical concept that develops as an attempt to begin to kind of codify in the scientific manner distinctions between different types of people holds that there is some sort of biological foundation. And so racial categories are supposed to be kind of responsive to this. So they are either accurately characterizing this like biological fact or not. So it will be in virtue of that ascriptions of racial categories to a particular person are semantically appropriate or not, true or false. And that this somehow generates kind of discrete categories rather than just continuous ones, say, in which you take a particular characteristic that gets racialized, like skin color. This is a function of the amount of melanin a person has, and this varies not in any sort of categorical manner such that you have this amount or you don't. It's something that operates along a kind of gradient continuum. You could have more or less, and there are both kind of environmental influences here, but this is also something that can vary like relatively slightly within one person's life. So this is supposed to be something that this sort of essence or the set of necessary and sufficient conditions are something that are passed down from generation to generation. And it's in virtue of this that the sort of judgments about racial identity can be mapped by inferences about the categories of one's parents, that these categories are bound in some way to geographic regions, say continents perhaps. And in virtue of this, one might think, well, then there ought to be, say, like 5 races. And then there's the idea that, well, this manifests itself both in terms of these physical phenotypes, but it also, such as skin color, eye shape, hair texture, bone structure, but also perhaps behavioral phenotypes such as intelligence or delinquency. And so it's in virtue of these sort of things that the sort of racist justifications aim to draw from. So it's worth noting that this kind of notion of race is purporting to be what we can call a natural kind. And we can distinguish this from something like a social kind. The kind of prior notion of a kind we can think of as functioning in basically the same way as a type does. And recall, if we think about the distinction between mental, physical, and abstract, then a type is a kind of abstract object. And so it's a sort of category. And you could have categories which have like perfectly arbitrary circumscriptions. Say you have the category of thing that is either the Eiffel Tower or the Mona Lisa's nose. You call those both objects of type like 52, say. You could think of that as a type, and that obviously doesn't have any underlying sort of natural similarity between the two objects. So we could admit of a kind of plenitude of such kinds. There's the notion, though, that there are some kinds that really succeed in carving nature at its joints, and it's thought that things like physics and biology are attempting to do this. They're telling us something about the structure of the natural world. They're telling us what the laws of nature are like. And so one way in which we can sort of see then a very kind of plausibly clear distinction between a natural kind and a social kind, say, consider the conditions under which water freezes at, say, like sea level. It's at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, and compare that to the speed at which one breaks the law or, say, is guilty of a traffic violation. And here it's quite obvious that, well, it's not something about the sort of like substance itself of, say, like the speed of the vehicle or the constitution of the vehicle. In order to know when one has broken the law, one has to reference the various sort of contingent social agreements that have led to whatever speed being designated as the relevant maximum speed.
It is worth noting, however, that red cars are more likely to get pulled over.
Yeah, that
Red cars are more likely to get pulled over, since we're on the subject. But
that might be explicable in terms of like psychological sort of like generalizations. So there's perhaps a partially sort of natural explanation in that case. So racial categories purport to be natural kinds, and so they claim that they are carving the world at its joints, that they are distinguishing something that is sort of real. The first sort of explicit codification of a theory of racial categories is developed by this French anthropologist, Francois Bernier. He's born in 1625 and dies in 1688. He published this book in 1684. It's titled A New Division of the Earth. And he claims within that races are natural kinds. It's worth noting, though, that the sort of way in which he carves up these categories differs quite substantially from a lot of the ways that you might sort of pre-theoretically think that we would classify people. So part of what that tells you is that, well, the sort of notions of race that have developed from this point have involved quite a lot of change, and we'll only be surveying a very small sort of subset of these developments. There's a lot more, and what I want you to sort of like see over the course of this is just like the immense difficulty in providing a kind of principled means by which one distinguishes the sort of various categories that are proposed. So Francois Bernier had done some traveling, and he observed, well, people in different parts of the world appear quite different. And the only thing that could explain that, he thought, was that, well, there's something actually naturally, physically distinct about them. There are these sort of underlying similarities that are manifest across different regions. And this must mean there's something like a kind of essential set of characteristics that distinguishes one set of people from another. And he posited a category that he called Europeans. This includes a lot of Western Europe and Southern Europe. It also includes the northern half of Africa. So North Africans are counted as Europeans in Francois Bernier's classification schema. There are then Africans, who are particularly those that live south of the Sahara. Asia, China, and Siberia constitute a third kind of racial category, he thinks. There are what he calls the Laplanders, which you might call Scandinavians, these Northern Europeans that he says are distinguishable on the basis of how pale they are. And he considers Native Americans as a fifth racial category, but then decides that they are actually also Europeans. So one thing to note here is there's a great deal of geographic sort of distance and variation amongst these categories. It's not quite clear what the underlying principle is that could generate such a set of groups carved just as they are. Francois Bernier also leaves kind of indeterminate his postulate about how exactly we should conceive of race as a natural category. And after his death, there are many more sort of race theorists that get involved in the project of trying to develop a schema of sorting people into these various groups. And again, note that this is seemingly like largely in response to the fact that, well, European powers have engaged in this kind of colonial project, have kidnapped people away from their homes, have forced them into conditions of servitude, have deprived them of autonomy. And this provides a kind of explanation by which they can explain that deep sort of conflict and tension away. So there's the question of whether racial categories are ultimately kind of superficial, that all Homo sapiens have a single point of origin, or whether there are multiple distinct points of origin, and so racial categories are really like kind of similar to how we might think of like subspecies within, say, like dogs. And so we can call these kind of theoretical camps monogenesists and polygenesists. Monogenesists believe that all human beings have a common ancestry, and monogenesis is supported by our best theory of evolutionary biology, that all human beings, or all Homo sapiens, originated from northern Africa around the Fertile Crescent. There was, for quite a while, and particularly in the United States, amongst anthropologists that were kind of politically aligned with preservation of the institution of slavery, they argued that racial categories were actually of this sort of more substantive biological distinction, such that we could think of races as denoting different sort of geographic points of origin for different cultures. Immanuel Kant is one of the earlier kind of race science proponents. He wrote of the different human races. He claims all human beings descend from a common lineal root genus, so he's a monogenicist, although he thinks that the sort of common point of origin is Europe. So he's mistaken in this respect. He is correct in some aspects of his theory. He thought that these sort of distinct phenotypic expressions were responses to different environmental factors, and this is kind of widely supported in our best kind of scientific understanding of the subject matter. He thought we could explain then the sort of emergence of distinct racial categories on the basis of differences that result from patterns of migration, geographic isolation over time, and breeding within a sort of biologically isolated population. He says this gives rise to 4 distinct quote-unquote pure races: the noble blonde of Northern Europe, the black of Southern Africa, the olive yellow of Asia, India, and the copper red of America and East Asia. So note we get a kind of different sort of carving schema than we see in Bernier, whereas Bernier thought that Europeans and Native Americans were, and North Africans were all of the same racial category. Bernier, or Kant, thinks that America and East Asia constitute a single kind of racial category. During the 19th century, there was a great deal of controversy amongst these various race theorists about what the correct and appropriate schema for dividing up human beings into different categories was. this German anthropologist Blumenbach was the first to coin the kind of carving schema of Caucasian. He posited 5 racial categories and thought that they were distinct, that race was a kind of biological category, and that you could distinguish racial category on the basis of skull shape. So he thought that this could then provide a kind of material basis for distinctions between racial categories in some substantive way, and that this could provide, as a kind of social and political consequence, justification for differences in treatment. So he posited Caucasians, Mongolians, Malayans, Ethiopians, and Americans. And note that this ends up, again, a bit different than the kind of schemas we've seen before. And there's the question of, well, so these are all positing these categories. They're saying that there's something real that they're somehow mapping. And the question is, well, what actually is that? We see later developments quite closely connected in many respects to Blumenbach's work of the development of phrenology and psychology during the kind of mid to late 1800s. And the idea that not only could you sort of distinguish these various characteristics, like intelligence and whatnot, but you could also discern, say, like how trustworthy a person is on the basis of the shape of their skull. So you can see in this bottom right image that the phrenologist purports that you can distinguish between a genuine husband and an unreliable one on the basis of these various sort of features of their facial structure. And if we take this at a sort of removed standpoint, then there's a kind of like absurdity to this. But this is used in like quite deliberately pernicious ways, and is during the time in which it has its sort of most potency, quite efficacious in setting or in persuading or shaping the thinking of these various actors who institute social policies, and they cordon off people into various groups, limit their freedoms, etc. So what exactly are these categories dependent on? What is it that they're actually supposed to be responsive to? If we think about the conditions under which racial categories are applied, well, it seems to be on the basis of these various phenotypic expressions that are racialized, and so encoded as being sort of instances of like their associated racial category. So people often talk about skin color. There's reasons we'll see that skin color can't sort of uniquely provide for that. If we look at various cases and intuitive classifications, then somebody could be like lighter skinned but black, and somebody could be darker skinned but Asian. So skin color doesn't seem to be sort of something which is uniquely determining racial category. And skin color, like other features that are racialized, is what we can call a Cline, which is a kind of biological characteristic that operates along a continuum. One can have more or less, and there's variation without sort of categorical difference. So, moreover, these characteristics vary independently from one another. So one sort of characteristic that sometimes gets racialized is like the width of one's nose. And this is largely like a response to one's environment or the climate in which one lives. And like over generations, there are environmental sort of selection pressures that make certain outcomes or distributions of features more or less likely. The fact that these vary independently of one another means if these are supposed to provide a sort of standard by which we can say, well, if somebody has all of these characteristics, then they belong appropriately to this category or this category. Well, the fact that they vary independently from one another means that those things are going to operate in different directions, and it's going to make it very hard to provide any sort of like principled and seemingly non-arbitrary kind of classification schema. There's a link here to a video by Eduardo Macheri. He's a philosopher that does work in the kind of intersection between philosophy of race and philosophy of biology. And he talks about some of these kind of historical considerations, but he dives much more deeply into the questions of biology. And he argues, and I'll provide a kind of brief summary here, that, well, as we've kind of seen, race purports to be this kind of biological category. It attempts to carve nature at its joints, and it will depend upon the existence of sort of essential genes, such that in our sort of like contemporary way of thinking about it, we no longer use the notion of Aristotelian essences. We, from like the 1800s on, have adopted this sort of conceptual schema of genes. And the idea then is, well, for somebody to count as a member of some particular racial category is for them to have some specified set of genes that all and only members of that racial category have. And so each racial category is then distinguishable on the basis of these. Note that this fits quite well with the sort of standard theory of concepts, where a concept is made up of a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. So the idea is then one is a member of a particular racial category, X, if they have attributes A, B, and C. Someone is a member of racial category Y if they have traits D, F, and so on and so on. And what it turns out is, well, there's just absolutely nothing in the world that could actually fulfill this sort of function. So, the kind of brief summary version of the argument, first in terms of its kind of formal structure, is that, well, the historical concept of race is committed to there being something like racial essences or these naturally grounded category differences. There are essential genes. And so we have the conditional then, if race is real, then there are racial essences. And what that video discusses and what we'll see detailed kind of briefly in a moment is that, well, there's actually no good grounds for believing that this is true, that the kind of best and most comprehensive analysis of genetic differences between people shows that there's a wider degree of genetic variation within any racial category than there is between them, which means that the differences are very small, and you're going to find like overlapping sort of patterns, and so they're not actually carving sets of necessary and sufficient conditions or that are mutually exclusive. So because the theory is predicated on there being these distinguishing characteristics and the failure of those things to exist, well, then if we have a conditional and the negation of a consequent, we can derive the negation of the antecedent. So we can derive that races are not real, or that the historical concept of race is false. It fails to carve nature at its joints. It works something more like witchcraft, say, than it does like oxygen. So concerning these genetic differences, which we make these sort of pre-theoretic classifications on the basis of phenotypic expression, but phenotype seems like it's ultimately less sort of fundamental than genotype. There's possibility of phenotypic variation without genotypic variation, which poses a kind of additional problem. But these phenotypic differences are ultimately clinal or gradient. They're gradual responses to an environment over generations. So if you take somebody of one particular racial category, you move them to a geographic part of the world that is associated with a different racial category, then over time you're going to see them, or you'll see their descendants manifest these phenotypic expressions, which will be more environmentally suited. And if we look at the sort of genetic similarity of any two people, then any two people will have like 99.9% genetically identical sort of constitution. So there's very little variation between people. At a genetic level, there's relatively less genetic variation amongst human beings than there are amongst like other mammals. And if we look at like genetic diversity, there's like greater genetic diversity within the continent of Africa than in any sort of like other subpopulation. And this in many respects should be like not that unexpected, given that Homo sapiens originated in Africa and fanned out from there over many tens of thousands of years. And so we can find then particular instances in sort of examining genetic similarity and difference of people who, say, if you have three people, then say two of those are classified as members of the same race and one of those is classified as a member of some different race. It could be possible that any one of them could be more genetically similar to the person who's classified as a member of a different race, then they bear similarity to either one of then either one of them bear similarity to the other. And these are like fairly small differences, but this shows that the sort of variation you can get within racial categories is larger than you find between racial categories. For a kind of graphical representation concerning Clines, if we look at skin color, then you can see it's largely a function of proximity to the equator. And if you look at the different sorts of regions here, you'll find, say, within parts of India, if you say like, well, race should simply be tracking skin color, or race simply does track skin color, then on that basis, there would be parts of South America and India in which you should classify people as black, but intuitively people of India are Asian, people of South America are South American. And so this shows that, well, it seems like the classification schema is actually quite arbitrary. It's not carving nature at its joints. It seems to be fairly kind of arbitrary. And if you begin looking at like a lot of cases, or you say like, look at a bunch of people and try to come up with racial classifications, you'll see it's like quite difficult. It doesn't seem like there's a principled underlying explanation. So some of the kind of questions then that are worth asking, well, okay, if there seems not to be any sort of clear underlying substance matter that we could identify with racial categories, well then, like, what exactly is race? There's the kind of organizing question again. Well, how should we think about this in relation to other sorts of categories that aims to group people into different categories? What kind of a category is race then? Is it a biological category? It seems like, well, it's impossible to identify an underlying sort of subject matter which could justify the ordinary distinctions and ascriptions of race classifications to different people. Is it social then? And how many races are there? What is the organizing principle if there's no sort of underlying biological similarity that grounds it? We might hold, well, race is purportedly biological, but what it aims to carve out, or what it claims are the organizing principles of that, fail to accurately represent the world as it is. And so we should think there are no races, strictly speaking. We could say that race is something like a fiction, and fictions can organize ways of life. They can have quite substantial influence in one's thinking, but they nonetheless fail to be real. We'll talk briefly about how we might think about some of the kind of classification schema here more generally. There's the question, well, is race real? And kind of normative questions about how we approach this. Well, if race fails to be a biological category, then if that's the nature of the concept we've inherited, what should we do with this concept? It seems like there's a kind of plausible case to be made that, well, look, like obviously there are races that seem to have like a great deal of like influence on the shape of like our collective lives and ordinary thinking. And there seem to be like correctness conditions associated with ascriptions. If I say I'm black, then that seems like obviously false. And so it seems like, well, then there could be conditions under which racial ascriptions like might be semantically appropriate or true. And how then should we understand what those conditions are? Or you might think, well, look, we have a concept that is quite pernicious in many of its functions, and we ought to think about how we could repurpose it for purposes which align with considerations of justice. So what should we do with the concept of race? Before we get into these kind of different normative views, I want to briefly talk about how we might think about the question of, well, what is race and does race exist in terms of semantic and ontological commitments? So recall we have two dimensions: semantics and ontology, theory of meaning and theory of existence. And we can distinguish between thick and thin semantic theories and thick and thin ontological theories. So what we might classify as the thick semantics, thick ontology view is the view that race is a biological category and it is real, or there are racial categories. The argument that we've seen to this point suggests that this view is false. There's the thick semantics, thin ontology, which says, yeah, that's basically like what we mean by race. It is this purportedly biological category, and we are intending to pick out genuine differences that exist in virtue of something like different genetics. But there's just nothing like that. And so fictionalists can give a kind of correctness conditions where they say, look, if race was real, then these ascriptions could be justified, but it's not. And so it's strictly, all such ascriptions are strictly speaking false. The fictionalist can then give some explanation of the sort of social phenomena of race, and they can give an account of correctness conditions. There are, we can call thin semanticists or social constructionists, who claim that race is real, but it doesn't bear the kinds of commitments that are built into the relatively more thick theory, which says that race is real. It has these kind of weighty, or it has these weighty commitments to what the world is like, i.e., that it's a biological category. So thin semanticists say that race is made real by things like social practices. And they think, well, so it's made real by us, and they can give a kind of intuitive accounting of how it is that we then sort people into these associated categories. There's very few people that occupy this kind of fourth quadrant of thin semantics and thick ontology, because they have to claim that, well, when we're talking about race, we're just talking about these kind of superficial characteristics that get racialized, and where race is a kind of social construct. But they think what exists is accurately captured by the thick semantics, thick ontology view. It says that there are these genuine differences. So this view is infrequently argued for, in part because it requires arguing for the most controversial aspects of each of the previous sort of positive theories. They have to argue, well, there really are these sort of essences that exist in nature. And they have to argue at the same time, well, when we're talking about race, we're actually talking about things that exist sort of purely at the social level, or what we're talking about are social categories. And one might argue that we should be a little bit suspicious, sort of from a prima facie standpoint, of each of those, because they seem to depart from a kind of flat reading. So to the kind of normative question then, what is it that we ought to do with the concept of race? We'll look at three sorts of proposals that carve up the space kind of generally. There's the position of eliminativism, which says that we ought to take the view that race is a kind of fiction, that it purports to be biological, and that when we then think about the sort of relative merits of that the concept of race, on balance, causes more harm than good, and so we ought to do away with it. There's the view of preservationism, which says that it's somewhat more complicated than that. Race certainly is tied up, the concept is tied up in these sort of pernicious social functions and discrimination, but it also provides something like a kind of common social identity, and it provides a means by which we can rectify past social injustices. If we simply fail, if we do away with our concept of race, then we will undermine our own ability to recognize racism, the argument goes. And there are reconstructionists, which say that we should kind of take a step back and think about what it is that we want the concept of race to do, and we should design something which will take a kind of ameliorative approach. This has been advocated by Sally Haslanger. So one of the most prominent eliminativists is Anthony Appia, and his argument in summary form is that, well, our historical concept of race is committed to certain scientific theses being true. What we've discussed, that the theory of race is committed to the idea that there are these essential like genes that are possessed by all and only members of some racial category and which distinguish them from others. That, as we've seen, that's false. And Anthony Appiah draws a sort of analogy to the scientific concept of phlogiston, which attempted to provide an explanation of the flammability of objects. It posited the sort of substance to be found within them, that the amount of that substance then correlated directly with how flammable they were. That theory is no longer in common use because it failed to carve nature at its joints, and we subsequently did away with it. Anthony Appiah suggests, well, just as that theory wasn't useful, our theory of race is not useful, and it carries with it social harms, and so we would be better off doing away with that concept as we do away with other scientific concepts that fail to achieve an accurate representation of the nature of the world. So he says our concept of race is failing to pick out anything substantively real. At best, it's made real by social practices, kind of background assumptions. And these social practices and assumptions are socially destructive and harmful to people. So he thinks we should get rid of our race-based thought and talk. A little bit more detail on the concept of phlogiston. So it was a theoretical entity posited by 17th to 18th century chemists or alchemists. This was before chemistry developed into the kind of scientific field that we can easily identify. And so they posited that, well, things are flammable because they have large quantities of phlogiston in them. Plants and fibrous materials are phlogiston heavy, whereas metals are relatively less phlogiston rich. And so they posited this as a kind of substance. And they found then, well, there's a problem, because if this is a substance, then, as the theory posits, when something burns, it dephlogisticates. The phlogiston is released into the air. And so all things that burn should lose mass. And what they discovered was that, well, some things lose mass, some things gain mass. Steel, for instance, when burned, can gain mass, or iron. And so they posited then, well, perhaps phlogiston has a negative mass, and so it makes things relatively lighter, and then when things dephlogisticate, they become heavier. But this failed to provide a kind of unifying or comprehensive explanation. And so this put a great deal of tension on the theory of phlogiston. Some tried to defend it against this nonetheless, but with subsequent generations, the theory kind of lost support, and the explanation which replaced it was that this has to do with oxygen, actually. Things which are oxygen rich are more flammable than things which are not. So if you have a vacuum, then you won't be able to create a fire. Whereas if you have an oxygen rich atmosphere, then, and something which is relatively porous, then it will be flammable. So Anthony Appiah has made this argument that, well, our scientific theories purport to accurately represent the world. If we have a concept then that fails at what it's intending to do, and it causes more harm than good, then we ought to do away with that concept. He says, the truth is that there are no races. There is nothing in the world that can do all we ask race to do for us. And he notes that it seems to be kind of pulled in these various competing directions by the various sorts of demands we have on it from a kind of pre-theoretical standpoint. So competing theory, preservationism, says, no, we should hold that races are real, they do exist, but they aren't the same kind of biological category, which was purported by the historical concept of race. There's various sort of ways in which preservationist theories of race get articulated. There are some that hold that race is, in some broad sense, kind of natural, that it has to do with biology and the selection choices of human beings, and we see people naturally group into the categories that we would associate with different racial categories. Some that take that route say that the problem with the prior theory of race was its theory of concepts, the theory that a concept is composed of necessary and sufficient conditions. And so some preservationists take the approach that we should understand concepts as these loosely grouped clusters of ideas, and there's no sort of necessary threshold that must be met in order for one to qualify as a member. We see use of this sort of framework in psychology during the 20th century, and parts of philosophy of language as well. And you could find it modeled in something like the following case. Think about the notion of bird, and think about various kind of paradigm cases. You have perhaps like robins, and you might think of various sort of like features that birds have. You might think, well, they're small and they're winged, they can fly, they have talons. And we can find various cases where it seems like, although those are frequent features that birds have, they are not universal. There are birds that are quite large, like ostriches. There are birds that can't fly, like ostriches, penguins, and chickens. And so, likewise, they think, well, racial categories ought to be understood as similarly kind of non-essential. There are just these kind of clusters of attributes that hang together. And so one can occupy like a more determinate position with regards to a racial category or not. Allocation will be somewhat fuzzier in this case rather than being kind of binary where they do fit into a racial category or they don't. We'll talk about that more in a second. But some of the considerations that motivate preservationism begin with kind of social and political considerations that, well, look, if we simply do away with our concept of race, as the eliminativist proposes, then we're going to lose theoretical and conceptual resources that are necessary for implementing some justice in the world. We should note, for instance, that prison populations are not representative, nor are they appropriately calibrated to anything like harm or threat. If we look at prison populations within the United States, which has the largest prison population in the world, something like 25% of all of the world's prisoners, then we can see, well, 0.7% of the total white population of the US is in prison, 2% of the Latino population is in prison, and 5% of the Black population is in prison. And yet, if we look at actual human behavior, then we don't find amongst these people that get classified into different categories substantially different rates of purported like criminality or whatnot. We don't see relevantly different rates of like drug usage or whatnot, and yet we see very different rates of policing of these communities. So part of the way in which these categories are sort of like made real or reinforced over time is through like legislative and political decisions. There is like during Nixon's war on drugs, for instance, the classification of different types of cocaine into different categories of punishment. So like lower grade, less expensive cocaine that gets called crack gets much higher sentencing associated with it than relevantly more expensive cocaine, which is more frequently consumed by people who are wealthier and statistically more often to be white. So we'll return to Reconstructionism in a bit. So a graph that represents some of these disparities. On the left, you can see the percentage of the state population that each kind of quote unquote racial category makes up. And on the right, the portion of the prison population which they make up. And this gives us one sort of metric for measuring like disparities and injustices. So preservationism is a sort of racial realism. Racial realism is the kind of broad category of classification which holds that races are real or exist, that there are racial categories in some substantive sense. They claim race is not a fiction. And so they sometimes argue for racial realists, like might argue for this on the basis of thinking that there are racial essences, or they might argue for this on the basis of considerations about the sort of like social like weight and practicality of notions of race, or they might argue for this on the basis of considerations about justice and the need to address past like injustices. So one sort then, which I mentioned earlier, is this one which attempts to claim that race is a kind of natural category, but does away with the notion of concepts as being composed of necessary and sufficient conditions. So this sort of view is called a kind of social naturalism or a population naturalism. And it understands racial categories then as kind of roughly analogous to biologically isolated populations of individuals. So social naturalism then says, well, there aren't sort of hard lines or edges around these concepts. There are cases in which like it may be indeterminate whether somebody occupies a particular racial category or not. And we can contrast that with the kind of concerns motivated by justice. For the alternative argument for a kind of realism, we can call this pragmatic realism. And the view here is that, well, the concept of race does indispensable work. It explains social phenomena. It can provide us an accurate description of one's motivation sometimes. And it's useful in seeking to redress injustices and determining who is owed what. And so on those grounds, we ought to preserve the concept of race. I want to turn kind of briefly to some arguments that might be made against some of these theories. So, for instance, against social naturalism, then one thing to note is that this is going to depart in some ways kind of substantially from some of our pre-theoretic intuitions. For instance, on this view, then we ought to understand racial categories as being fuzzy in nature. Things like intermarriage and the existence of biracial persons seems to undermine the long-term persistence or perhaps even usefulness of racial categories. It seems that if we recognize this sort of fuzziness, then this, to some extent, creates a kind of pressure for collapse of the categories. And we find also that if we kind of draw out some of the consequences of this, if we say that we ought to understand these as something like biologically isolated populations, then, well, in the context of the 21st century, in which there's a great deal of like global travel and migration, well, you find people of purportedly different racial categories occupying all parts of the world. And so what this is actually doing for you then now is of seemingly relatively limited use or of limited function in terms of providing any sort of useful explanation. But we do find some places where it seems like there are sort of like quite determinately isolated populations, and yet those populations don't seem what we would sort of be pre-theoretically inclined to describe as racial populations. For instance, the Amish live with a far greater deal of social isolation than many different populations of people, and yet we kind of pre-theoretically think of the Amish as a kind of religious community and not a racial community. There's also kind of considerations here about some points of tension. The two women in this picture, for instance, are twins, and yet sort of in terms of pre-theoretical classifications of race, it seems like the one on the right would be classified as black, whereas the one on the left would be classified as white. They're both British. And we can look at two sorts of views regarding race as a kind of socially real thing. There's the view called strong social constructionism, that race is made real and determined by things like social practices and assumptions, various sort of like institutional features or facts. And we can contrast this with what's called weak social constructionism, which says that the determination of category and a racial class is actually like far more difficult than that, and that there's a lot more arbitrariness and fluidity surrounding how it is that we should understand the correctness conditions of various race terms. One or two kind of considerations which provide countervailing considerations against strong social constructionism. So strong social constructionism says that practices and assumptions determine membership in a racial category. And there's the kind of phenomenon of passing, which say, consider the movie Sorry to Bother You, in which there's a black guy who works at a call center, and he's told by one of his colleagues that he should use his white voice, and when he calls, and doing so, he successfully convinces people that he's white, and so he's treated as white, and the person he's talking to assumes that he is. And so on the theory of strong social constructionism, it seems that we'd be pushed to say, well, he is white, or he becomes white in those instances, and then is not white in other instances because he's not treated as white. There's also the phenomenon of traveling, which is that, well, if you move from one geographic location, from one culture to another, then the way in which racial classification schemas operate can change. And yet, kind of pre-theoretically, like moving from one geographical region to another doesn't change one's racial category. So these provide some kind of what we might take to be pieces of intuitive evidence that push against strong social constructionism. So if we think that we should understand race as a kind of social category, that gives us some reason to think that weak social constructionism might be more plausible. And the last kind of general sort of view, Reconstructionism, says that we should develop a new concept of race, figure out what we want that concept to do. And so we should engage in this sort of project of engineering our concepts to meet these kind of normative aims, what it is that we think they ought to do. So Haslanger's idea is we should determine what the point of a concept of race is, what is it that this ought to do, and figure out how we can sort of engineer a conceptual framework which will help us achieve that goal. And so she thinks, well, look, we obviously ought to be concerned with ways of mitigating injustice and normative inequality. And so we then ought to conceive of race she thinks also gender, as categories that enter into these kind of liberatory and justice-oriented projects. She says a theory of race or gender should be responsive to the following concerns: the need to identify and explain persistent inequalities between men and women, and often between people of quote unquote different colors. This includes the concern to identify how social forces, often under the guise of biological forces, work to perpetuate such inequalities. Second, the need for a framework that will be sensitive to both the similarities and differences among men and women, and the similarities and differences among individuals and groups demarcated by various quote-unquote colors. This includes the concern to identify the effects of interlocking oppressions, e.g. the intersectionality of race, class, and gender. Third, the need for an account that will track how gender and race are implicated in a broad range of social phenomena, extending beyond those that obviously concern sexual or racial difference. For instance, whether art, religion, philosophy, science, or law might be gendered and or racialized. That is, whether in the kind of context of the dominant culture, whether there are background assumptions and stereotypes that lean towards expectations about whether somebody is appropriate for a certain type of career or not, say whether somebody is fit to become a doctor. And there's obviously sort of ways in which cultural expectations get facilitated through that. And fourth, the need for accounts of gender and race to take seriously the agency of women and people of color of both genders, and within which we can develop an understanding of agency that will aid feminist and anti-racist efforts to empower critical social agents. So this gives the theory its sort of have normative orientation. It says that we have to think about where it is we kind of move from here. Haslanger, although a reconstructionist, is also actually a kind of eliminativist in the long term. She thinks we ought to do away with these categories of race and gender. And so we ought to think about how to develop categories that will facilitate that movement. Okay, so I want to return to consideration of these kind of organizing questions, and we can sort them into kind of semantic questions, the questions concerning meaning. What is it we mean by race? What kind of thing is that? How should we understand the contours of that concept? The subsequent ontological questions, having clarified a notion of race, well, does that accurately represent the world or not? Is race real? And normative questions, given the sort of history of the concept of race, the way in which it operates in ordinary contexts, what should we do with it? How should we orient ourselves towards it? What sort of aims should we have in kind of employing it? Should we try to modify it, etc.? Okay. So that's all for now. And if you have any questions, let me know. And I'll see you next time.